There's been a spattering of underrated games over the past years, and some of them only reach their deserved stardom years later, and many of them just really disappear into the wormhole of mediocre games that come out every year. I'm glad to have picked up on a few of the most underrated games from the last 5 years, and it's been wonderful to play them. Sadly, most of these games haven't gotten the much needed recognition they deserved, so here are the most underrated games from the last 5 years. When we talk about Titanfall, we don't really mention the second game. Hell, I don't even think people know there's a second game. Everyone was riled up to play Titanfall 1's fantastic multiplayer, and that's what it was known for. People didn't ever imagine a great single-player storyline for the franchise, but that's exactly what happened. Titanfall 2 was all about reassuring the franchise to more success with a great storyline, but the game really didn't make it. I stumbled across Titanfall 2's incredibly underrated single-player campaign on a walkthrough, after which I couldn't stop myself. I just had to play it, and it didn't disappoint. Titanfall 2 had to compete with big names like Hitman, Gears of War 4, Dark Souls 3, Uncharted 4, Final Fantasy 15, Dishonored 2, and so many others that came out that year. And to be honest, it really fell short because, come on, I just told you those names, didn't I? It took the game a few years before the wide review of it was positive, and of course, there were franchise veterans who'd picked up the game and played it on its initial release, but the numbers weren't great compared to its predecessor. Another classic case of being overshadowed by the big guns. Astral Chain by Platinum Games is an action-adventure game set in the distant future with a whole bunch of sci-fi stuff happening. You know, the whole space creatures invading kind of thing? At first glance, the game would really look like another JRPG, but when you get deeper into the game, you're suddenly faced with the question, why in the world isn't this more popular? Astral Chain was heavily overshadowed by 29 heavyweights Death Stranding, Jedi Fallen Order, Metro Exodus, and a host of other games that were much higher up in the pecking order than this one. As the story goes, players join a police force called Neuron, with a designated role for each member who acts as their partner in both the detective and combat sections of the game. That's right, the game's not just some hack-slash-your-way-through-your enemies kind of game, there's actually a detective aspect to it as well. A very ambitious project that surprisingly runs well on the Nintendo Switch, considering how crazy some sections can be. The game is dotted with great moments of humor and emotion that made for a good plot. It's just a shame that it didn't get its worth when it released. Star Wars Battlefront 2 began with several massive controversies surrounding so many things about the game. We'd need another video to actually talk about those things. We're talking about connectivity, microtransactions, gameplay, bugs, all of that sort of stuff. After years of updates and content releases, all for free, the current game is a redemption story that you might want to remember. Everything that seemed to be a problem before is now wonderfully addressed and made even better. The game is now a fantastic shooter for both fans of the movie as well as shooter fans in general. Battlefront 2 is a top-notch class shooter, and most of the game modes and maps are great to play, even though there's a tiny percentage of modes that didn't really get much appreciation. The game overall is day and night different for what it used to be when it was released. Not many can emulate the feeling of descending into battle wielding the iconic green lightsaber of Luke Skywalker or using Slave 1's seismic charge. Watch Dogs was such a disappointment when it first came out. It was nothing like what Ubisoft promised. The game was glitchy, buggy, and an outright mess. It was so bad that some elements of the game that were promised weren't even there in the final edition. Watch Dogs 2 fell to the same initial impression. People thought Ubisoft wouldn't learn from their mistakes, but I'm very glad to say that they actually did. The second edition in the series is a gem. I played it very recently, and I must tell you that it feels nothing like its predecessor, although they kept a lot of similarities in gameplay. Watch Dogs 2 takes a more youthful approach to the whole digital hacking fiasco that the series is known for. The game is filled to the brim with a fantastic open-world San Francisco for exploration, great side missions, really interesting hacking mechanics, a good main storyline, great puzzles, and an overall fluid gaming experience. Watch Dogs 2 made sure it mended the ways of the first Watch Dogs. If you haven't played this game, you really should. I think we're all too late for this one. The charm of LawBreakers at its time was something to talk about. Now, with so many similar titles, it's hard to put this one on top. The game, although, is severely underrated and was constantly overshadowed by the sheer number of AAA titles that came out in 2017. Reviewers called it an arena shooter that was fast yet nimble and elegant all at the same time. The game integrates classic mouse aim skills with the addictive accent of class-based gaming, and the combination of that was perfect at the time. It didn't get its praise because it was 2017, the year when it felt like multiplayer shooters were sticking to their roots, and it was about to get much worse too, as PUBG would show up a couple of months later and then people just forgot about any other shooter that existed outside the Battle Royale genre. The game struggled to find a crown amongst such massive titles that it shut down permanently in 2018. Although we can't play it anymore, I do have to mention it because it was a good game. House of the Dying Sun is an interesting spaceship shooter in the sense that it plays quite literally like any other shooter. Interesting, right? Which in itself should have pushed the game into stardom. But well, here we are. The gameplay is intense and punishing as you switch between the spaceship and the entire fleet. Similar to Homeworld, but with a lot of differences. The game was really fun, and it's really harsh to see such a good title fall below the radar of many. House of the Dying Sun could have been one of those revolutionary spaceship shooters that brought about change in the genre, and I could see many following suit, but the game was immensely overshadowed by bigger titles, and for some reason, not a lot of people wanted to play a spaceship shooter that year. The game didn't get the attention it really deserved.
Let the tale of Fenyx be my redemption!
Immortals: Fenyx Rising is surprisingly a Ubisoft franchise that slipped under the radar of many during its release in December 2020. A game that's clearly inspired by The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, Fenyx Rising is a light-hearted take on the Greek mythos. The story is unique in its own way, with several references making it quite relevant to its premise in Greek mythology. You play as Fenyx, a mortal soldier shipwrecked on an island, and that's how the story starts. What really stands out about the storytelling is that this entire storyline is dictated by Prometheus the Titan to Zeus. The gameplay is fantastic. It really brings out the joy of playing a game similar to Breath of the Wild, with ideas and mechanics that are fresh but seem familiar. The visuals, on the other hand, are something to really boast about, implementing the same art style as games before, but with a subtle twist. Ubisoft sure outdid themselves with this one, considering the amount of stick they've gotten for previous games, but maybe this one was overshadowed because of that. Made of Skur by Wales Interactive is a piece of art that's heavily influenced by horror titles of the past. Big names like Amnesia, The Dark Descent, and Outlast come to mind when playing this game, and that isn't a bad thing at all actually. Heavily underrated, this game definitely slipped through the cracks last year. It probably did so because of several bad reviews left by players who blatantly thought it was a direct copy of the Amnesia games. Rest assured, Made of Skur is quite different. From the challenges of being constantly in fear of something lurking in the shadows, to finding clues and pieces of puzzles in the game, this title should have made a name for itself in the big leagues. Another fantastic game that could have done much better if it were better appreciated by the purists.
Said our people lived peacefully until the men appeared from the sea, intent on making our lands their own.
The team behind Technomancer Spiders released a wonderful action RPG called Greedfall back in September 2019, and although the game received mixed reviews on its release, mainly due to the bugs that came with it, the game otherwise is a fantastic example of how good RPG elements can stick to action gameplay. This game earns a mention in our list as it deserved better than the reception it got. Greedfall provided immersive gameplay in a unique blend of fantasy meets the 17th century, with an intricately woven story that was shaped around the decisions of the player. Greedfall was hailed as last year's honorary Dragon Age, itching the scratch that many players had for a new fantasy action adventure. The problem with the comparison to Dragon Age was that people were too quick to hold this indie game up to the same standards of a AAA franchise.
How I miss the taste of flesh.
The thing about Rage 2 is not that it's an underdog per se, it's more like it disappears after initial burst on the hype trade because probably of its repetitive nature and awful story, but if you put those hindrances aside, Rage 2 is a great popcorn shooter. Where it lacks in story and tactical intellect, it makes up for in pure, stupid action. The game isn't difficult by any means, but the whole point of it is to create havoc, and that's exactly what you should expect. The initial impressions of the game were more of the lines of a Mad Max dystopian setting, but Rage 2 isn't as in-depth as Mad Max. It's a little bit lighter, I'd say, playing a little bit more on the fun side. In fact, it did remind me of the bandits from Borderlands and Fallout's Raiders. Those similarities are quite prominent. It's stupid, pure, expressive FPS joy, and don't expect any more than that.
Just give him back.
A gripping view on mental health, Hellblade was well received, but it isn't for the faint-hearted. Players take the role of Senua, an 8th century warrior on a quest to save the soul of her former lover Dillion from the goddess Hela. The deep, dark, in-depth notes on mental health and its effect are very well adjusted in this game, hence it's not for the faint-hearted. Senua experiences hallucinations and other mental afflictions in what is an incredible, radical and genre-bending game that should have been a masterpiece for its time, but was ridiculously overshadowed because of its concept. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this list, consider subscribing to our channel Gaming Region and hitting that like button. You have no idea how much it helps us. As always, see you in the next one. Peace.